Hello again, and welcome to our LinkedIn Live broadcast on the release of the ISM Services PMI Report. I'm Dan Zeiger, Senior Writer and Editor for Inside Supply Management. That, of course, is Institute for Supply Management's member publication, and we're happy that you're with us as we break down the Services PMI data for April. New orders growth slowed, but other demand signals were encouraging. Business activity picked up, prices leveled off, but remained at a 3.5-year high, and employment contracted again. Exports and imports activity even expanded again, and I'll resist the urge to make another Art Vandelay joke about that. But put it all together, and the Services PMI was down slightly to 53.6%. So there's a lot to talk about as usual. So let's bring in Steve Miller. He is the chair of the ISM Services Business Survey Committee. Steve, how you doing? And what stood out about the April data?
I'm doing well, Dan. The thing that stood out most to me is that we didn't see a huge increase in the supplier deliveries number. And we saw a huge drop in new orders, which in isolation looks like a big concern. But when you look as what's happened over the last 3 months and over the last 12 months, it seems like not a whole lot of smoke there.
Yeah, we'll get into that. That was my first question. We'll talk about the demand indicators. I mean, as you alluded to at first glance, kind of, you might say, mixed results. New orders index did decrease 7.1 percentage points to 53.5%, but business activity, which was 55.9%, backlog of orders 53%, new export orders 52.1%. Those indexes either stabilized or they reversed their slides in March. Is this more encouraging? I know you just alluded to now in an earlier call that new orders index may be more of a correction than anything. Just give us the overall lay of the land there.
Sure. What's when you look at across all of the numbers, we see 9 of the sub indexes in expansion territory. The only one that's in contraction is employment. And that's up from last month. Last month, we saw the same 9 sub-indexes in expansion territory, but employment at a lower number. And the month before that, we saw all 10 sub-indexes in expansion territory. So I think we're seeing some robust activity across the board with exports and imports, third month in a row where both of them are up. We're seeing backlog of orders still sustaining in expansion territory, even with new orders. But back to the new orders number we saw in February and March, 4 points above the 12-month average, at least. And so what we saw in the commentary last month is we're buying ahead to avoid, from some of the companies, we're buying ahead to avoid transportation and fuel cost impacts into our cost of goods. And so when you look at this month in the context of all of that and look at the trailing 12 months, that new orders number is less than 0.5 point below the average for the last 12 months, whereas we saw, very significant spike in the last 2. So in that context, I'm usually the optimist on these numbers. So I'm thinking that's a positive.
Yeah. Before we get to some of the other index data that stood out, you had mentioned the supplier deliveries index in the lead-in. And I wanted to ask you a little bit about that. It was up just slightly, 0.6 percentage point over the previous month, up to 56.8%. I mean, that's pretty robust, but, considering, some of the, geopolitical difficulties that companies have had to deal with, was that kind of a surprise, a pleasant surprise that it didn't shoot up any higher than that?
It was, Dan. I think it was possible in my estimation that we could have been up 1 or 2 points in that. After listening to what was happening around jet fuel and shortages around jet fuel and how that might impact imported products, given that imports were still in expansion territory, I expected to see more of that disruption come through. It seems like we just have expensive jet fuel. There's no shortages or out of stocks. I guess there are shortages, just not out of stocks yet, that are significantly impacting supply chains. So I think that's hugely positive, especially if we can get the Strait of Hormuz flowing again, where we can start bringing down some of those costs, and we can start replenishing stocks of petroleum products or of oil. I believe it was Goldman Sachs came out with a report. It was either yesterday or today that we're at all-time lows or recent lows in oil inventory.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to have to fill that up. Right? We're going to have to get that in order to be able to continue to have some return to respond or respectable pricing, not exorbitant pricing on oil. And the longer that continues, the longer it'll get embedded into manufactured products using oil or higher energy costs. So I think all of that kind of rolls in together with a little check mark that supplier deliveries did not have a significant increase. Although when you look at the numbers, Dan, we're in the 56s 2 months in a row. Last time we were at 56 was in September of 24 for 1 month. Mm-hmm. You got to go back to September 22 before you see a 56 handle again. Mm-hmm. And then it was all of the recovery from COVID, where we're in the 60s and the 70s. Right. So putting this issue in context with the recovery from COVID and getting people back in the workplace and being able to get industry back and running, not even in the same league.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Let's go into another index reading that probably people were expecting worse, especially with what happened in the manufacturing sector. But that was the prices index in April. It stabilized, but it still stayed elevated. It was 70.7% for the second month in a row. That equals the highest reading since October of 22, when it was also 70.7%. For the second straight month, no commodities were reported as down in price. 17 were up in price. And we've been talking about oil and petroleum. You had a comment in the report that I will ask you about in a second about that. But, just once again, given the circumstances and what we've seen in manufacturing, was that prices index reading, kind of a minor sigh of relief?
It was. I thought we would see a higher number because we had commentary in last month's report that we hadn't quite seen what was expected in terms of flow through in petroleum products. We got similar commentary again this month, where we're seeing it come through in diesel, gasoline, fuel prices, but in some areas, we're still not seeing it flow through in petroleum related products like plastics and other. So cautious optimism that we can get off of the $105 barrel of oil, which basically we saw last month too. So, is the March, April kind of in the hunt, bouncing between the mid 80s to the hundreds, the reason why we didn't go up any higher because we didn't see any higher spikes? Is it because we haven't seen all of that flow through yet into manufactured products that are required within services industries? Or will we see a drop down to 90 or back to the mid 80s next month with some of the actions that are going on in the Strait of Hormuz to help with tanker flow, bring some relief to that pricing and relieve some of that pricing pressure on the direct materials while that flow through happens on the manufactured materials? A lot of kind of things in the air on that one, Dan.
Yeah. Well, that leads to the comment that really stood out to me in the report. And obviously, if you work in supply chain, you know that products have to work their way through, and the prices often come with it. And you said in the report that a lot of the business survey panelists have yet to see price increases impacting petroleum-related products. So we expect to see continued elevated readings for the prices index for several months, regardless of when the conflict in Iran ends, because these costs have to work their way through global supply chains. Just elaborate that on a little bit.
Sure. So we're seeing costs in transportation currently, and those costs directly related to cost per barrel of oil and those refined products going into transportation costs, whether it's jet fuel or whether it's diesel fuel for trucks or others. If the oil price drops to $85 a barrel, or $80 a barrel, or even $65 a barrel in July or August or September, we've still got several months of additional costs that are going to be in our cost of transportation. You don't see those costs of transportation in many cases related to input goods for the services, say products that are getting delivered to a construction site, until much later on, when that's built into the final cost of housing that hasn't already been contracted for. So you've got to see some time for that to work its way through pricing, and then pricing to be reflected in the actual cost of purchases that are being made. Now, if you take that and relate it to manufactured products that have a high content of oil in them, or oil-related products in them, that stretches out that impact window even further, as those goods are currently being manufactured using those higher prices, and then they get put into other products, and then those products, like switchgear or others, get purchased by utility companies, and then in order to pay for them, they've got to raise their cost per kilowatt hour that they're charging out. So things like that are things that I expect to see to some degree flowing through the supply chain for 6 months from now anyway, if the prices went down today. The longer it goes and the more time it's going to take to replace or replenish petroleum inventories, which will then be used at a higher cost to then flow through those products, just means that cost pressure will be extended. I don't know enough about petroleum-related costs in our economy to know what percentage that is versus what percentage the increased transportation costs and fuel costs will be. I do know, though, that for the first time in history, the USPS is putting a surcharge, a fuel surcharge, in parcel deliveries for the next year. So that will impact at least that part of the services economy for anybody that loves to get their parcels delivered via FedEx, UPS, or USPS. There isn't anywhere to turn where fuel surcharges haven't gone up.
Yeah, well, that's a perfect lead in to the next question. And it is based on our comment for the month that we like to pick out and share and discuss. And this month it was from a panelist in construction, and he or she wrote that spring selling season for the home building construction market is here, but interest rates, inflation, and oil supply issues are keeping buyers on the fence. Discounts and rate buy downs remain the driver of sales as affordability continues to be the hindrance for buyers. Cost cutting and value engineering have reduced costs to pre-COVID pandemic levels, but inflation and rising oil prices threaten that hard work. Here we go. Fuel surcharges, previously whispers, have become requests. And I noticed that in the report, surcharges were mentioned multiple times in the comments. I mean, there in that particular comment, there was a lot of moving parts in there. Feel free to discuss as you want, but fuel surcharges as specifically, they were mentioned multiple times. Just how big of a headache have they become, or are they becoming for services companies?
It seems like month over month it's increasing, Dan. Mm-hmm. We're seeing it flow through in comments, or did see it flow through in comments in April for actual cost impacts. Fortunately, it sounds like this individual has done a nice job of working with their suppliers to keep those from flowing in. We saw in the last mid-year supply chain forecast that we as an industry tend to try and hold on to those cost pressures to not create a competitive issue in terms of us selling our services or selling products through wholesale and retail until we just have to, that we've exhausted other options. So for me, it sounds very normal that there was a services provider there that said, can we weather the storm for a couple of months? Yeah, we can. Now we can't. We're carrying higher and higher costs, and it's eroding our margin. And so we have to go to our customers and say, we're going to need to work, even though we negotiated this pricing before, maybe it's LTL pricing or truckload pricing, these schedules that we have for our fuel surcharges, we're going to have to implement and use because we don't have any other option.
Yeah. One last question related to pricing, and then we'll make it kind of a combo of pricing and import-export activity question. But, we were talking about panelist comments and what the some of the subjects were. I went through the panelist comments that were published in the report, and I only saw tariffs once, unless I missed it. Obviously the war and geopolitics were the more prevalent topics right now. So, Sue Spence in manufacturing kind of alluded that tariff sentiment might be cooling off or a little bit, or at least internalized as companies, start to deal with it a little bit better. And that be the reason the exports and the imports activity has been a positive development for the third month in a row.
So in the report, there were not a lot of tariff comments. In our respondents, it was not uncommon. So it was the second highest frequency of responses that we got were responses that included some comment on tariffs. I think the places where it was hidden is in inflation. So there were many more comments around inflation, higher prices, which you could attribute to the conflict in the Middle East, but I think are more appropriate to attribute to tariffs now just being part of cost of operations. So we ended up having to take price increases related to tariffs. Some of those tariffs are even going higher for some, from 10 to 15%, or have gone higher from 10 to 15%. And those are now embedded in our 2026 financial plan of us paying higher prices. The comments related to the war, conflict, Middle East, that type of thing, was 3 times the comments that we got on tariffs. So that was where we're seeing the overwhelming kind of concern, or very prevalent rather than overwhelming concern around what those impacts can be. And some of the old sayings around cost and savings is, we love your savings, but don't let me run out of product. So when you've got tariffs, we're talking about savings and cost of operations, war, reduction of inventory, potentially running out of aviation fuel. That's, will I get my stuff? And so, as expected, and I think the right focus is, we got to keep the supply chain working, and we've got to at the same time figure out how to manage costs appropriately. Yeah.
Just to give you the exact numbers on that, our viewers, the new export orders index was at 52.1. That was up 1.4 percentage points over the previous month, and the imports was at 54.7. So pretty healthy activity there. Another index where you alluded to it in the intro, 9 of the 10 sub indexes were in positive territory. I would think most people would think the one sub-index you don't want to have in contraction in any particular month is the one that is. That is the employment index. It improved, but it did stay in contraction at 48%. 74.9% of companies surveyed reported having the same staffing levels as the previous month. That's a little bit better than it was in March. Couple of panelist comments, you can flesh it out for me a little bit, but the ones that I saw in the report, a little bit more pessimistic. One of them said there's been an uptick in attrition, but just discuss the overall employment situation with the big federal jobs report coming in a couple days.
Yeah, it's looking, kind of in the context of the last year, what we saw, June through November. You saw 47.7, 46.9, 46.9, 47.6, 48.1, 48.7. So a 48 reading after a 45 in March isn't where we want it to be. I mean, we want to see industry growing and employment growing. But I was pretty happy with the return from a 45 to a 48. 48 is 0.6 percentage points below our 12-month average. So we're seeing continued growth from the overall services PMI. Since the first of the year, we're seeing 54.4 starting from January till now. Average last year was 51.7. The average the year before was 52.4. So I think we're seeing some good signs in the economy, and with good signs in the economy, and once the shock of what has been going on in Iran kind of mutes itself, or hopefully goes away when we can reach an agreement and things can start getting back to normal. I think that speaks well for employment. With the one watch out of services industry, particularly finance and insurance, information, management consulting, other management services, where coding, data, and analytics are kind of very important components of employment. AI is kind of uniquely developed to impact those areas. So where we're seeing positives on utilities, wholesale trade, and information and construction from data center builds, we haven't yet seen, at least in the commentary, impacts due to AI flowing through employment. So maybe it'll be just like other industrial revolutions or revolutions of productivity. We'll see new jobs and new jobs at a higher level than what we've seen before. But had a conversation with a very experienced accounting guy about 3 weeks ago, and one of the roles that he has is doing company valuations post-acquisition. And he said, Steve, something that took me 2 months to do in the past, I can get done in less than a day. And so those types of things where the risk is high of making calculations incorrectly, but the productivity opportunity is also high, remains to be seen how fast that will move, whether we'll be able to build some confidence that the results that we're getting from AI are ones that we can act on without having to check through every decision that was made, or whether it's not, and it won't really impact productivity. I think the question is definitely out, and we're also seeing a little bit of that in our respondents in terms of whether it's adding or decreasing the level of effort that's required in more administrative or analytical roles.
Yeah. Well, yeah, as you know, Steve, you were there. I mean, AI was definitely the talk, the most brought up subject by far at the ISM World annual conference in Denver.
And some very exciting applications, Dan.
Yeah.
So I think the promise is there as long as we can execute on them.
Yeah, and we'll have a lot to say and write about that topic as the months and the years go on. For sure. One last index reading before I just ask you if there's anything we haven't discussed, or a couple of them. It was another robust month for inventories. It was down slightly, but still 53.1%. And inventory sentiment, 55.1%. That was actually up a tick. So companies probably don't feel like they're short right now. But yeah, I did see one comment, one word in the comment that we may start to see a lot of more of. That word is fertilizer. And of course, agriculture is a big key services industry. Just discuss the inventory situation, and maybe are there some things you mentioned? We talked about fuel earlier, that we may have to start worrying about shortages soon.
I think that's a fantastic call out, Dan.
Yeah.
We have three industries in contraction. The one contracting fastest: agriculture, forestry, fishing, and hunting. You got to believe that the pressure and availability of fertilizer is having a significant impact there. The one that I didn't call out, and I think I should have called out earlier, that's a really good catch. It has to flow through in pricing. That's going to be direct consumer pricing impact, and so it remains to be seen how much, because it's not only the cost of goods to make products, it's the availability at that price point to be able to maintain productivity and production within agriculture. So it's a double whammy in terms of what the prices of produce will be this summer and related products. Yeah.
Well, we have a couple minutes left before we wrap up. I mean, I'll combine the two questions I usually ask you to wrap it up here. I mean, if I'm a CEO or executive, what are some of the takeaways I should have, with this data? And was there anything that we haven't discussed or that I haven't asked that you think might be important to include before we wrap up?
One of the things that have been asked a few times, over the life of the time that I've been doing the report is, with the prices paid, why aren't we seeing, or how are we seeing those numbers reflected in inflation? And I often go back to COVID, where we started pumping trillions of dollars from the government into the economy, and then that went into spending, and then spending into prices and into inflation. We're starting to see this, in my opinion, in the stock market, where we're seeing the market continue to go to record levels, with that availability. If prices are going up, especially in luxury goods, and people can afford to buy them, they're going to. And so that's one of the risks, I think, that's out there in terms of inflationary numbers, is that with that availability of cash now in the market, because we're not going to be able to do a equity mortgage in your house, because you can't do it at 6% or 6.5% or 7.5%, whatever it's going for right now. How will that impact our ability to buy with these higher prices flowing through? And will that be kind of a hard to control pressure on inflation? So for me, that's probably one of the things that maybe it's out there a bit, but something that we should have on our radar.
Yeah. This is going to take us over a minute. Our apologies to our viewers. If you got to go and you got a meeting, you can catch the replay or catch it later on YouTube. But we always like to take audience questions when we get them, if we have time, and we'll try to squeeze in an extra minute here. This is from a respondent in Turkey, Steve, and he or she says, given the ongoing wars and trade and tariff sanctions, do you expect a return to the pre-crisis normal, or as we saw post-COVID? Or are we looking at a fundamental shift in supply chains and cost structures that will define a new normal? I know we've been writing about a new normal even since before COVID. So there's been a lot of disruptions and dynamics that supply managers have had to deal with over the last decade. But here comes the pitch. Yeah, just take a swing at that.
I think what we're going to see, and it remains to be seen how big of an impact it's going to be, but we're going to see a tendency to like local production more, whether it's local production here, local production in Europe, local production in China. One of the things we didn't talk about was just fuel costs for countries that are low-cost producers that rely on fossil fuels almost exclusively, like Vietnam. People are going to start seeing those costs flow into their supply chain. And I think that that's going to give us some more momentum into really shifting the way we do production and what risks we're willing to accept. So I don't expect a dramatic shift, but I do see, percentage point 5-10% shift from taking advantage of low cost opportunities versus reliability of cost and supply.
Yeah. And as I say often, that's the great thing about the ISM data, the PMI data. You can see those shifts happen in the numbers. So it's always fun to come back here every month and break them down. Hey, Steve, thanks a lot. We'll see you for the semi-annual. We'll get a LinkedIn call on that, and we'll go from there. But thanks a lot. Appreciate it.
Have a great one.
Yeah. Hey, thanks for joining us today. And you can go to ISM's website in a little bit and read the roundup article that details a lot of what Steve and I have discussed here. Also, as I just said, mark your calendars for May 15th when ISM releases its supply chain planning forecast for the manufacturing and services sectors. That report will detail recent performance and panelist sentiments for the rest of the year. And as I said, is at a date to be determined, we will get together with Steve and Susan Spence from the Manufacturing Business Survey Committee for a LinkedIn Live broadcast to talk about that supply chain planning forecast. And finally, if you want to be a part of the ISM Manufacturing or Services Business Survey panels that help compile data for the ISM PMI reports, visit ismworld.org, join the panel for more information. Hey, thanks for sticking with us for a couple extra minutes, and we'll see you back here next month when we break down the ISM PMI data reports data for May. So for Steve Miller and some good people who helped us behind the scenes, they are Christina Cahill and Jennifer Stevens. I'm Dan Zeiger, and we'll see you next time.